Well, welcome back for another lecture on ecosystems. In this particular lecture, we are going to talk about how energy flows through an ecosystem. And this is going to take us through a conversation of food webs and talking about the relationship of different organisms with each other. Particularly, our focus here is on predation, because predation is primarily the way that energy is going to flow. I'm going to introduce to you quite a bit of new terminology, but we're going to try to use it all in context. And so I hope that will help you to understand the meaning of these terms and to give you an idea of how to use them as well. So let us begin by briefly defining food chain and food web. And I'm sure that many of you have at least an idea of what these are. Probably in elementary school and middle school, you were building food chains, which is really just a series of steps where organisms transfer energy by eating or by being eaten. In other words, they're transferring energy from one organism to the next through predation. More realistically, though, we don't look at chains where one organism is passing on its energy to the next, and so on and so forth. Instead, we see more of an integrated model in which we have food webs, and that's what we're going to create in today's lecture. Food webs are networks of feeding relationships, and I kind of like to think of them as interconnected food chains. And so if you were to take 6 or 7 different food chains and combine them into a single network, that becomes a food web. Now let's first take a look at the brief feeding relationships that exist within ecosystems. Here I am showing you the way in which energy is transferred. Sun is going to be a form of energy that is used by producers. And producers typically include our autotrophs, which are organisms like plants that produce their own food from inorganic matter. And then producers provide energy that is passed along to consumers. And consumers are organisms that are going to eat other organisms to get their energy. And so we are examples of consumers. In the past, we've used the term heterotroph as another way to describe these consumers, which again are organisms that eat other organisms. Now, in food webs, we also include what we call the detritivores, or the decomposers. When producers and consumers die, their material is decayed or broken down into inorganic matter by detritivores, which include earthworms, bacteria, fungus, and even the sea cucumber that we will talk about today. The detritivores take that decaying organic matter, they consume it to provide themselves with energy, and they convert that organic matter into inorganic matter. This inorganic matter then provides the energy, or provides at least the building blocks for producers to create more energy. And so you can see here that this is going to be somewhat cyclical. We oftentimes think about this as energy flowing in one direction, from sunlight to producers to consumers and ultimately to detritivores. Now let's take a look at a specific example. This is one you might consider as being part of a coral reef. If you want to, imagine yourself being at the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, but there are many different types of reefs in which we see these different types of organisms. And so what we're going to do is we're going to label the organisms. We are going to label them or characterize them by whether they're producers or consumers, and then we're going to talk about the relationships of them to build this food web. So let's start at the bottom here with algae and seagrass. These are both autotrophs that use sunlight and inorganic matter to produce their own energy. We also call them producers. These producers provide food for the sea turtle. The sea turtle eats algae. The surgeonfish eats seagrass. And the sea turtle and the surgeonfish represent what we call primary consumers. Primary consumers eat the producers, and oftentimes primary consumers we can also classify as being herbivores. Herbivores are organisms that eat only plant material to produce their energy, or to gain their energy. Now, the surgeonfish is prey for the octopus and the coral grouper. The octopus and the coral grouper represent our secondary consumers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. We can also consider these secondary consumers in this case to be carnivores. There is a third classification. In addition to herbivores and carnivores, we also have omnivores, whereas carnivores eat only meat and herbivores eat only plants. The omnivores eat both plants and animals, and so we can find them as both primary consumers and secondary or even tertiary consumers. So again, the secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and then we're going to go to our last level here, and this coral reef, or this reef shark, eats sea turtles, octopus, and coral grouper. And so this reef shark is a tertiary consumer. We could also define it as a carnivore since it only eats meat. And we could also define it as an apex predator. Apex here means top of the top. Because this reef shark has no natural predators of its own, it is considered to be the top predator or apex predator within this food web. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that these different levels, how we've organized these organisms, we call them trophic levels. The producers occupy the first trophic level, that is the lowest level. The second, third, and fourth trophic levels are all occupied by consumers. The second trophic level, in particular, is occupied by those primary consumers and herbivores. And then the third and fourth trophic level are occupied by carnivores, at least in this food web. It's also important to note here that we do have a detritivore in this particular food web, and that is the seed cucumber. Now, the sea cucumber does not directly eat any of these organisms while they are living. Instead, after they have passed away, the decaying organic material becomes food for the sea cucumber. The sea cucumber may also eat off of dead skin cells, feces that's being released by these organisms, or other organic matter that still has nutrients and energy to be gained. And so the sea cucumber in this case here then is going to consume that organic matter, break it down into inorganic matter, including CO2 and other types of nitrogen or phosphorus containing products. And this organic matter plus sunlight again is going to provide the essential components for those producers to create more seagrass and to create more algae. One thing that may become apparent to you here is the fact that each of these organisms relies on the other ones in order to live, or in order to be produced. None of them can really live in isolation or complete isolation, but also down the road we'll start to talk about how removal of organisms or overabundance of organisms might affect ecosystems like this one here. Now, another way that we can look at these relationships between organisms is with what's known as an energy pyramid. Let's talk about how this energy pyramid is organized. You'll see on the left here I have listed the trophic levels. This particular energy pyramid is going to have 5 levels. The food web that we looked at just a minute ago had only 4 levels, and so it would only have a pyramid divided into fourths. At the bottom, we have our producers, which again are our autotrophs. These are organisms that are producing essentially their own food, and in part, they're getting energy from sunlight and inorganic materials. The producers are consumed by our primary consumers, which we defined as herbivores. Those herbivores then will be consumed by secondary consumers. We may also find in this group of secondary consumers omnivores that eat producers as well as primary consumers. In our fourth level, we're probably mostly going to have carnivores here, which are our tertiary consumers. And then, not in all ecosystems, but in some, we may find a fifth trophic level containing what we call the quaternary consumer. Whatever is at the top of this pyramid, though, is our apex predators, or are the apex predators of our particular pyramid. Now, energy pyramids follow what we call a 10% rule, and this rule basically defines the movement of energy throughout an ecosystem. Recall that this movement is in one direction from producers all the way up to quaternary consumers. And the 10% rule says that basically only 10% of the energy is passed from one trophic level to the next. In other words, if we start with 100% of energy in our first trophic level, then the second will only maintain 10% of that energy. The third would only contain 1%, or 10% of level 2. The fourth level would contain 0.1%, and the fifth level would contain 0.01%. In each of these steps, 90% of the energy is being lost from one trophic level to the next. And you may ask yourself, well, how is this energy being lost? Primarily, that energy is lost in the form of activity and in the form of heat. Because each organism is going to perform different activities, and because organisms are going to release heat as a result of their metabolism, we find that this energy is released from one trophic level to the next. Now, sometimes we might also talk about what we call biomass pyramids or number pyramids. Similarly to the energy pyramid, we assume that the amount of biomass from one level to the next is only going to decrease. And both the biomass pyramid and the number pyramid roughly follow the 10% rule. So, for example, if we have 1 million producers, we might assume then that in the sense of numbers, we have 100,000 primary consumers, we have 10,000 secondary consumers, 1,000 tertiary consumers, and 100 quaternary consumers in this particular pyramid. So, in summary, the energy pyramid, the biomass pyramid, and the number pyramid give us an idea of the flow of energy and the flow of mass from one level to the next in a trophic pyramid like this one. We assume that only 10% of the energy, 10% of the biomass, and 10% of the total number of organisms is being passed from one trophic level to the next. Let's not forget, though, that our detritivores are not included in this energy pyramid. They, again, would consume dead organic matter from any of these groups and provide the inorganic material that is needed for those producers to grow.